Today's discussion will be moderated by Ryan Smart, the Executive Director of the Florida Springs Council, and he will be joined by Lisa Rinaman from St. John's Riverkeeper, Mike Cliburn from Friends of Wekiva River, and Casey Fitzgerald from Reunite the Rivers. If you are joining us live, thank you for joining, and you can leave comments in the chat on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and we'll have time at the end dedicated to a Q&A. Ryan, you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Chloe. And thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. We've got a really cool presentation with three of my favorite environmental advocates who I'm very lucky to have also serve on the board of the Florida Springs Council. And we're going to take you on a little policy tour of what we need to do to protect the St. John's River, looking at opportunities and challenges and some of the major systems that influence the St. John's. And I'm really excited for our first guest tonight, which is Lisa Rinaman. Lisa is the St. John's Riverkeeper. I've been working with Lisa for about a dozen years now. Riverkeeper does an amazing job protecting the St. John's River, all the way from the headwaters up to where I live in Jacksonville. They're a group that means a lot to me that I love to be involved with here in Jack. So thanks for being here, Lisa, and please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. And I appreciate you tuning in tonight to talk about one of my favorite subjects, to protect the St. John's River and how we can be more resilient for our river. Next slide. And the St. John's is actually a spring-fed river. So it's the longest spring-fed river in the state of Florida, and actually the longest river in the state of Florida. It travels 310 miles over its journey, beginning in Indian River County, there at the Blue Star. The headwaters of the St. John's are actually in Indian, Brevard, and Osceola counties. And it goes 310 miles, and over that long journey, it drops in elevation only 28 feet, or actually 27 feet. So it is one of the laziest rivers in the state of Florida. Problem with that is when bad things go into the river, it tends to stick around for a long time. Its watershed covers 16% of the state. And so when we talk about protecting the St. John's River, it's not just the main channel, the main river itself. It's also its springs, its tributaries, as well as all the many lakes that make up the River of Lakes. Next slide. So to do our work, to fulfill our mission of defending the St. John's and advocate for its protection, it's focusing on its springs, its tributaries. And we investigate issues, we educate, we advocate, and then we activate our members. It's all about citizen advocacy and how we can truly make a difference and give our river a voice. We negotiate good solutions, and when we don't get a negotiated position on good policy or a good permit, then we will litigate if necessary. Next slide. One of the areas that we focus on is restoring and protecting the river's natural systems. Our wetlands and submerged grasses are critical to the health of the St. John's River. The river, these are the kidneys of the river. And so many are alarmed about the significant loss of freshwater wetlands, as well as these submerged grasses that are of immense importance. Next slide. These grasslands and wetlands, they provide important habitat. So as you lose submerged grasses, you lose the foundation of our commercial and recreational fisheries. Next slide. In addition, you lose biofiltration. Which if you lose the kidney function of the river, we see more blue-green algae toxic outbreaks like this one. And that does more harm to the grasses. One of the many stressors to our submerged grasses and why we're losing them at an alarming rate is that the blue-green algae, when they mat on the surface like this, they actually block the sunlight. And so our grasses aren't able to grow quickly enough to outpace the grazers and all the wildlife that depends on them. Next slide. And so in 2023, we launched our Save Our Rivers Grasses expedition. And the focus of this was to bring attention. And after Hurricane Irma, we lost nearly 90% of the submerged grasses in the lower St. John's. And that's on top of damage done in Duval County, North St. John's, and Clay County due to saltwater intrusion. This expedition was designed to go to 15 different locations. Going back to the site map, please. And so the next slide, we show you the site map where we identified an 80-mile section of the St. John's. And if you'll go to the next slide, it shows you where we focused on Doctors Lake all the way to Lake George, because this is the zone that is really in transition from saltwater intrusion. And we met with homeowners on their docks 3 times during the growing season of grasses. Next slide. And we focused at each dock and took water quality information. Agencies, while they do this work, they're not putting all of the different pieces together. So we're bringing forward science that's been done for decades in the agencies and collecting water quality, looking at salinity, temperature, DO, pH. And next slide. And once we take the water quality information, we literally get in the water to look for this eelgrass. It's so important to the river's health. And then once we find it, we actually measure it. We look at canopy height as well as density to see how the river's grasses are doing. And then we'll go back over the course of the growing season and map it out to determine how grass is doing at these different places over 80 miles of river. Next slide. Unfortunately, as we did find eelgrass, so that was good. It is under stress due to multiple stressors. And one of the things we also found was an abundance of cyanobacteria. This is a photograph from Lake George where we were expecting to find, number one, we wanted to find eelgrass. There was no eelgrass. And then we expected to have white sand, which has historically been the river bottom in Lake George. And if this actually was bright green, in fact, this photo doesn't do it justice. And when we took it to the lab, there were 5 different types of toxic cyanobacteria. And so this demonstrates the severe condition the river's in with too much toxic blue-green algae resulting from too much nutrient pollution. And so one of our next priorities in protecting the grasses is doing everything we can to stop pollution at source with nutrient pollution. Next slide. And that's one of the reasons we've been working since 2018 to reduce the impact of the land disposal of sewage sludge. Sewage sludge is the byproduct of sending sewage to the wastewater treatment facility to clean up the human waste. They have to take out all of the very highly polluted sludge or solids from our sewage. And the cheapest way for utilities to dump this very polluted substance is for fertilizer. It's high in nutrients, and so the farmers get free fertilizer. This practice was banned in South Florida because it was polluting the Everglades. And unfortunately, when it was banned in South Florida, North Florida wasn't granted the same protections. And so the cheapest place for utilities to transfer their sewage sludge, unfortunately, is the headwaters of the St. John's. When we first started working on this, they were actually transporting about 89,000 tons of sewage sludge to the headwaters. That dropped to about 70, then it dropped to 50, and we just heard it's inching back up, and it's nearly 80,000 tons again, and we're still waiting on the 2023 numbers. But not only is this a gross thing for them to be literally sending their human sewage byproducts to the headwaters of the St. John's, it's undermining the very foundation of the St. John's, as you see in the next slide. I know it's hard to see, but all of these little square dots, and particularly the triangles there in the headwaters, is showing that there's a dramatic increase in phosphorus in the headwaters. And this is undermining water quality of the St. John's River in the very first beginning of the river. So the first 100 miles, we're seeing significant increases in phosphorus, which leads to these toxic blue-green algae outbreaks. And the middle basin depends on a reduction of phosphorus and nitrogen in the headwaters. And the lower St. John's in Northeast Florida depends on a reduction in the middle basin. So this is a permitted new pollution source that's undermining the water quality of the St. John's River from its very source. And unfortunately, this is not the only threat to the headwaters that can do devastating damage to the entire 310 miles of the St. John's. Next slide. At the very end of the legislative session, we got wind of an enormous appropriation of $400 million for a project that's being sold as a water quality and a water supply project. What's happening is there is a farmland. There's a citrus farm right on the border of the South Florida Water Management District, south of the St. Johns River headwaters, and a portion of the St. Johns River headwaters. And the farmers are wanting to sell this land to the state and actually build a reservoir where they would take the dirty runoff, the polluted runoff from these farms that's currently running into the Indian River Lagoon, and transfer it into the St. Johns River, treat it a bit, but still sending polluted water into the St. Johns River and calling it water supply for Central Florida that will expand urban sprawl in Central Florida, where the majority of the springs that provide the St. Johns River, a critical fresh water source. So this is problematic for our springs. It's problematic for our St. Johns. It sends more polluted water north on top of the biosolids issue, the sewage sludge we just talked about. And it's just simply bad policy. There was never a committee hearing. There was no public discussion. And this is something that even the agencies working on this were surprised. They had no idea that this was coming out. Fortunately, the agencies have 20 pages of unanswered questions that actually have more concerns than we've even listed, and to determine that this is problematic and this project should be stopped because it will hurt our springs, it will hurt the St. Johns, and it will even send dirty water further north in the Indian River Lagoon. So it's not the win-win for the Indian River Lagoon either. Next slide. And so just to underscore the importance of stopping this project is in Central Florida, there's about 100 freshwater springs that provide the St. Johns critical freshwater flow. As you'll hear in a minute, our springs in Central Florida are also suffering. They're having low flow as well as water quality problems. When the springs of the St. Johns River are suffering, so is the St. Johns. And so just shifting water around and trying to figure out a way to come up with alternative water supplies runs the risk of hurting our river even further, as well as our springs. And so it's important we look at this holistically and deal with water conservation and true strategies that will save our springs and protect the St. Johns, and not just use the St. Johns as a pipeline to create more urban sprawl. Next slide. When we as we've overused our aquifer in Central Florida, and we've seen a reduction of spring flow since the St. Johns River is so flat, when you pull out fresh water or reduce fresh water, you see more saltwater intrusion. And so we're seeing more and more salt water go further upstream. This undermines our wetlands and our submerged grasses that we're losing at an alarming rate. And this is only getting worse with sea level rise, as well as, next slide, we've been straightening and dredging our river for more than 100 years to create a superhighway for cargo ships. And this has also created a superhighway for the Atlantic Ocean to send higher water levels and more salt water upstream. So at a time of crisis for the St. Johns, we need to focus on restoring freshwater flow, restoring our springs, not trying to create ways for us to use more of our aquifer to deplete and hurt our springs as well as the St. Johns. Next slide. And so one of our priorities to not only help our freshwater flow is reuniting the Ocklawaha, Silver Springs, and St. Johns. You'll hear a lot more about the other benefits of this game-changing project to reunite the rivers, but I'll save that for our speaker at the end of the program. Next slide. And with that, I just want to thank you all for this conversation. I'm excited to hear our next two speakers. If you want to get more detail about any of this I've talked about, you can go to stjohnsriverkeeper.org. But for now, I'll turn it back over to Ryan until we open up for questions at the end of the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was wonderful. And next we're going to go to, we've heard kind of about the headwaters of the St. Johns and the General River, and now we're going to jump over to Mike Cliburn. Mike is the treasurer of Friends of Wekiva River. He's a retired environmental engineer and the secretary of the Florida Springs Council. How are you tonight, Mike?
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to everyone for joining this webinar. Next slide, please, Chloe. And then the next one. I just wanted to take a minute for those of you who are not familiar with Friends of the Wekiva River. We were founded in 1982 by private citizens who were concerned about what was happening in the Wekiva River Basin. They accomplished some amazing things. They advocated for a legislation to protect the Wekiva River and were successful in getting the Wekiva Protection Act passed in 1988 and signed by the Governor Martinez. That same year, the Wekiva River was designated as an outstanding Florida water. And then our members actually testified before Congress in support of getting the Wekiva River designated as a wild and scenic river. So we're only one of two in the state that is wild and scenic. And then we also advocated for the Parkway Protection Act in 2004, which preserved 3,500 acres of conservation land and also provided for a corridor for wildlife under the parkway. Next slide, please, Chloe. These are some of the current issues that we're dealing with. Protecting the water quality in the Wekiva Basin, minimum flows and levels. There is extensive sedimentation in the Little Wekiva River that we've been working on remediation of that. And then protecting the Wekiva Basin from development. And then finally, a special project that we have underway is building a pavilion at Katie's Landing. Next slide, please. Starting with the water quality issues, in 2008, DEP determined that the Wekiva River and the springs were impaired because of excessive nitrates that was resulting in growth of nuisance algae. They set target concentrations for the river and the springs, 0.286 milligrams per liter of nitrates and 0.065 milligrams per liter of phosphorus. So to see how we're doing, next slide, please. Since in the 16 years since, the nitrogen levels in the Wekiva River have actually been declining, although they are still above the 0.286 milligrams per liter, which DEP determined to be safe for the ecosystem. Next, please. But in Wekiva Springs, the concentrations have been increasing in that same time frame. And next slide, please. The same for Rock Springs. And they're actually 3 to 4 times higher than what DEP recommended as their target level. Next slide. So in 2018, the DEP developed issued the Wekiva and Rock Springs Basin Management Action Plan, which we call BMAP. That plan determined that the nitrogen load to the groundwater, the Florida aquifer that feeds the springs, was over 1 million pounds a year, most of it coming from fertilizers, but also from septic tanks and wastewater treatment facilities. They proposed a reduction of only 200,000 pounds a year, which is only 20%. The Friends of the Wekiva were actually represented on the Technical Advisory Committee, and we advocated that they needed a 75% reduction of the nitrogen load in order to meet these criteria or the target concentrations. DEP ignored our advice, but interestingly, because of the Springs Council's challenge of the BMAPs, DEP revised their calculation methodology and determined that there actually is a need to reduce the nitrogen load by 75%. So we felt vindicated in that regard. Next slide. But one of the best outcomes of the BMAP was the emphasis on converting septic tanks to sewer. Orange County and Seminole County currently have plans underway. This is the Orange County plan. It's going to be built in 6 phases, 6 different neighborhoods. But the plan is to connect over 2,000 homes that are now in septic tank to sewer, which would reduce the nitrogen load to springs by over 20,000 pounds a year. Now, this isn't cheap. As you can imagine, installing sewers in existing subdivisions is very expensive and very difficult. Most of the cost is covered by grants from DEP, the Water Management District, and the federal government. Orange County is chipping in 25% so that the homeowners are only going to have to pay 10% of the cost. Next slide. But we're optimistic that this is going to be effective because this graph shows the flow lines in the Florida aquifer that feed the Wekiva Springs. And the flow in the Florida aquifer passes directly under these subdivisions that are targeted in this program. So the leachate from the septic tanks will no longer be going to the spring. So we're optimistic that when this program is finished, probably, hopefully in about 10 years or so, that we will see a reduction in the nitrate levels in Wekiva Springs. Next. And a topic that's really hot right now is the minimum flows and levels. The St. Johns River has issued a draft report this past November. The purpose of the minimum flows and levels is to establish what's the minimum flow in streams and springs and the minimum levels in lakes and wetlands that will be protective of the ecosystem. For the Wekiva Basin, they have determined that the MFL should be based on the conditions, the groundwater pumping conditions that were existing in 2014 to 2018, because the groundwater pumping is what affects the flow in the springs, because it reduces the flow from the Florida aquifer. So they've the Water Management District determined that because the groundwater pumping has increased since 2014 to 2018, there needs to be a recovery plan to bring the minimum flows and levels back to that condition. So they have proposed minimum flows and levels that are they contend to be protective of the ecosystems, but they are less than what would have occurred under a quote no groundwater pumping condition. As you can see, these percentages: Wekiva is about 8.7%, Wekiva Springs is 6.7%, Rock Springs is 16.6%. And they also determined that the proposed MFL will reduce wetlands inundation during high flows by about 15%. Now, we took issue with that, but they contend that this is still protective of the ecosystems. They've done extensive analysis to document their conclusions. And so we are going to be following, we've given them comments, and we're also going to be following their recovery plan, which they expect to issue in 2025. Next, please. One of the projects that we're very involved in at this point, one of our board members and several of our members are involved in this, is cleanup of sediment in the Little Wekiva River. Next. Before 2018, this is a photo of a dock of one of the landowners on the Little Wekiva River. This is downstream or north of State Road 434 on the Little Wekiva River. They had access for their canoes and kayaks. They had about 4 to 5 feet of water. But by October of 2020, the sediment had basically filled the stream bed. And by the end of the year, vegetation was growing. You could walk to their dock. Next slide. There were several potential sources, but the most suspicious one that was identified was the Y4 widening project. You can see I-4 there on the slide on the right, in the upper right corner. Then that's Markham Woods Road is in the center of the slide, and then the Little Wekiva River is to the left of Markham Woods Road. And that big brown area between the I-4 and the Markham Woods Road is a area where they stockpile sand for construction of the I-4 widening project. And residents observed sand during rainfall, sand flowing under Markham Woods Road through the culverts and entering the Little Wekiva River. So there have been ongoing discussions with the DOT about helping with this cleanup. Next slide. But fortunately, Seminole County has stepped up and they have taken the lead in doing the cleanup. They've been doing a great job. This is actually the river channel in late 2023, and then now you can see that that same dock, river access has been restored to that dock. So the remediation is working, but as you can still see from the picture, there's still a lot of work to be done. Next, please. One of the efforts that's been most time consuming for us is trying to protect the Wekiva protection area and the Wekiva study area from development that's not compatible with the area. The Wekiva Protection Act included criteria that the development in the Wekiva protection area should not exceed the intensity of one single family unit per acre. And the Wekiva Parkway and Protection Act also provided protections for the Wekiva study area, which were tied to comprehensive plans developed by the local governments. We've been successful in a couple of cases where the local governments weren't familiar with the Wekiva protection area criteria, and we were able to get some developments stopped. We've not been as successful in the Wekiva study area because the comprehensive plans can be changed by the local governments. But this has taken, this is one of our major efforts. We've got folks who attend every meeting of the Eustis City Council and most of the Lake and Seminole County Commission meetings to watch for these developments. Next slide, please. But one of those most things that we're most proud of is our project to build a pavilion at Katie's Landing. This is Katie's Landing is downstream of State Road 46 on the Wekiva River. Next slide, please. It was owned by Russ and Katie Moncrief. They were founding members of the Friends of the Wekiva River. They operated Katie's Landing for over 40 years as a canoe outpost, but they were very big on educating the people on why it was necessary to protect the river, and were strong advocates for the Wekiva River in their lifetime. Russ passed away a few years ago. Katie passed away this past fall. Next slide, please. We were hoping to have the pavilion built so that Katie could see it, but we've run into some permitting delays, and it also has taken us a bit of time to raise the money. We now have over $100,000 for this project, which we hope will be finished by the end of this year. So in 2025, as you're canoeing down the Wekiva River, hopefully you'll be able to stop at the pavilion at Katie's Landing. We are actually going to turn this over to the state park system because I think I failed to mention Katie and Russ turned the Katie's Landing site over to the state, and it's now administered as a state park. So you'll be able to stop there, take a break from your paddling and canoeing, have lunch, and next slide, please. So if anyone has any questions or wants to get more information about our activities, please you can get our newsletter and sign up at friendsofthewekivariver.org. Friendsofthewekiva.org, sorry. Okay, thanks, Ryan. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I really encourage anybody in the Orange, Seminole, Lake County area to check out Friends of Wekiva. They've done great work for decades and continue to do great work, and a lot of cool outings and great stuff. Thanks for that presentation, Mike. All right, and then our final speaker today before we get to Q&A at the end is Casey Fitzgerald. Casey is my board president at the Florida Springs Council. He also serves on the board of the Florida Springs Institute. He is majorly involved with Reunite the Rivers campaign that he's talking about today, and worked in Springs Protection and other initiatives at the St. Johns River Water Management District for quite a while. So Casey has a very unique skill set and experience, and is a real asset to our community. Thanks for being here, Casey.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for the opportunity and for everybody that's tuned in. So I'm going to give you a real quick tour of this project that is a truly game changer, as Lisa mentioned, for not only the St. Johns River, but for Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha River itself, and even for the Atlantic Ocean to some extent. So next slide. Real quickly, again, 40 slides in 10 minutes. It's going to be a challenge, but going to do an orientation, historical context for those of you who have no idea what this project might be all about, and then the restoration plan in 20 seconds or so. I'm going to give you a quick perspective on the tale of 4 ecosystems that this would affect, then itemize those environmental and ecological benefits, briefly touch on the favorable economics, recreational opportunities, talk about the public support that is overwhelming, and then a forecast for when something might be done on this project. Next. So in terms of orientation, historical context, and restoration, this is a picture of Rodman Reservoir that was created by Rodman Dam, as you would see it today when they do a drawdown. Obviously, there's a problem. Next. So the system starts to the Lake Apopka area down in the lower left-hand corner of the picture. It flows to the northeast, flows past Silver Springs where it gets a lot of its flow. You'll see it goes down into a reservoir system, a little opening in the pool there, right below, or right below, or right above Rodman Kirkpatrick Dam. You also see there's a Buckman Lock indicated there. Those are the two pieces of the project that were started by the Army Corps of Engineers back in the day. We'll talk about that. The lower Ocklawaha then flows into the St. John's, flows to the northeast, again, all the way up past Jacksonville and out into the South Atlantic Bight. Next. So this system was not built for any particularly good reason when it was built. It was created as an initial component of the very ill-fated Cross-Florida Barge Canal that, if that had actually been completed across the state, would have been completely disastrous. Unfortunately, we did get a couple of the two ends of it completed, and those were bad enough. Next slide. So this is a picture of the canal as it was going to be built. It's going to be started basically in Palatka off the St. John's River and go all the way across the state to Yankeetown. Again, had this project been completed, we would have had unbelievable damage to both the surficial aquifer and possibly even to the Floridan aquifer. Next. So this was a good idea back in the 1500s. It was a good idea to try to cut across the Florida peninsula so you didn't have to go around the entire peninsula and run aground on the reefs, for example. But when it was started in '63, it was actually way beyond the time that it was necessary. It was stopped in '71 due to environmental concerns, the National Environmental Policy Act that had been passed in, I think, '69. Governor Childs did direct partial restoration, which is I'll talk about a little bit. An application was submitted by DEP to the St. John's Water Management District, estimated cost of $25 million. There has been no state action since that time, however. Next. So what would partial restoration involve? Well, this is not going back to exactly the way things were before. The canal, as you can see, where Buckman Lock is located there, where the red star is, and Rodman Dam, where the yellow star is. But it would get back 95+% of the ecological benefits. So it's really a fairly simple project. You really just get the river back. You restore the hydrology. Then there's a plan to do it over a 3-year period. Make sure your tributaries are flowing, get the historic channel flowing again, breach the dam, do some backfilling as warranted. And really the challenge will be adaptive management to make sure that exotics don't come in, and try to get the floodplain forest back the way we want it. Next. So a tale of 4 ecosystems. Next. Ed Lowe was our lead scientist at St. John's. He's one of the most brilliant ecologists I've ever met. And he did a piece for us there, which I would play, but it's a bit lengthy. So I'll just try to summarize his overall perspective. And the biggest message that Ed had to share was the fact that not only everybody recognized that the water flow is being intercepted by this dam, but the big difference that wasn't really appreciated as much was the biological flow. So critters that used to go all the way from Lake Apopka or Silver Springs, down the Ocklawaha River, into the St. John's River and out into the Atlantic Ocean no longer could do that. The vast majority cannot get through that dam. They certainly don't go through the lock system. So we'll talk about those species, but keep in mind that some of these migrated all the way from, say, Silver Springs out into the Sargasso Sea, which is out, in the Atlantic Ocean. And these animals no longer make that trip and hence are no longer biologically available and do not serve their functions as they did in the ecosystem. Next. So what are these unprecedented environmental and ecological benefits that would accrue from breaching that dam and getting the system functioning as it should? Next. So as mentioned, we would restore Silver Springs, but we'd also, believe it or not, recover the 20 lost springs. We'll talk about that. Restore populations of numerous migratory fish species, provide critical winter habitat for hundreds of manatees, improve water quality, habitat, fisheries, and resiliency of the lower St. Johns River and estuary, and reestablish a critical link in the O2O corridor. Next. So regarding Silver Springs, next. Bob Knight, who just recently retired as executive director of Florida Springs Institute for decades, has been making it clear that you can never really restore Silver Springs without breaching the Rodman Kirkpatrick Dam. And this is because of all the species that would go back and forth. And you can see that on the picture there that the habitat has changed. It's not strictly due to the dam, but it is a contributing factor of major proportions. Next. And again, shockingly enough, there are 20 springs that we could recover instantly by draining this system. So if you look at it from a cost-effective basis, you could actually get 20 springs back. You could help restore Silver Springs. So there is, absolutely no other more effective springs restoration project in Florida. Next. This is just a picture in the upper left-hand corner, a painting that was done of Marion Blue Spring as it was back in the day. And below that is what it looks like today when the reservoir has it all inundated with some dark water. Cannon Springs to the right, also very similar situation. What you see down below is when they do a drawdown, they take it from 18 feet down to 11 feet. You can see the emerging spring there in the one on the left and the underwater photo on the right. So the springs are there, and they would come back in all their former glory if we were just able to get that reservoir drained. Next. And a really great concept. Many folks in Florida are used to paddling down the Santa Fe River, where you have a spring every half a mile to a mile. You would have a similar experience up here on the Ocklawaha. This is a theoretical springs paddling trail. And this is just the main springs along the system. There are about another 10 that you could also at least see the spring runs coming in and whatnot. Would be a tremendously fantastic recreational opportunity. Not only could you go down the old river channel and go up some of these spring runs and go swimming in some of the springs, you could also just see the 7,000 acres of floodplain that would come back, and you'd be able to watch restoration take place. Next. So let's talk about some of those migratory fish species. Next. Some of the species that no longer really make the trip, can't make the trip, are, say, on top there, you've got 2 catfish species that were very prominent. They were actually good food fish for a lot of folks who were doing subsistence fishing. They were also very common up in the Silver Springs area. They had one of the springs up there. There are 30 springs in the Silver Springs complex. One of them was actually called Catfish Hotel because so many catfish would swim around inside that spring. A couple of sport fish, the American shad and the striped bass, were very popular. And then 2 key species of the ecosystem, mullet and eels, frankly, were very important. And mullets still are very important, but not as many of them make it up the system now. But they're a good food fish for many other critters out there. And the eels are the ones that go all the way out to the Sargassum and have to make the trip all the way back. They no longer do that. And they were so prominent, there were actually commercial eel fisheries back in the day that no longer exist. Next. Manatees. Most of you know there was a huge die-off of manatees, mainly in the Indian River Lagoon in 21-22. There was a warm water action plan done shortly thereafter. And the key recommendation, or one of them, was restoring natural warm water refugia with nearby food sources being essential to preventing future die-offs. Next. And the Ocklawaha River would provide that service. Silver Springs Complex would provide all kinds of forage and that warm water they need in the winter so they don't get too cold and die from cold stress. The 20 Lost Springs would also add additional warm water refugia. And an old report from 2008 indicated that hundreds of manatees would live up in this system, and some have estimated as many as 1,000 could live up in this system. So this would be truly a lifeline for manatees. Next. And as Lisa was talking about, this would also be a huge contributing factor to the restoration of the lower St. Johns. This would deliver 150 million gallons a day of additional freshwater flow from the Ocklawaha to the St. Johns River and estuary. And you have to keep that balance in an estuary of freshwater and saltwater. And this would contribute to that. And secondarily, by getting this clearer and cooler water delivered at the right time with the right nutrients, you would also help get this eelgrass community to recover. You would offset that saltwater intrusion. You would actually improve water quality to help prevent those algal blooms that were so prominent in her pictures. And then also your fisheries would return. Next. Now, something we hadn't really thought about, I certainly hadn't, was how this would actually benefit terrestrial species. Next. The O2O corridor goes from Ocala National Forest up to Osceola. Notice in the red square there, that's where the reservoir and the ditch, the canal, are located. Species like the panther and black bear do not want to swim across these wide open areas. Next. So what you have here effectively is blockages from the migration of these species going north and south. And this is a critical greenway for these critters to expand their ranges and to just interact. Next. Yes. So if you did remove those, they're used to going through a floodplain forest. It would fill a portion of that canal that is shows the arrow on the far right-hand side. And so they would be able to migrate much easier north-south in this critical corridor. Next. So the economics, and again, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to talk much about it, but next. I will simply say very favorable economics. And this is based on a lot of studies that were done, which I'm not going to share with you, but next. We have a summary from Tax Watch, and they concluded after looking at all these that this was a good investment of Florida's funds, and that in fact the breaching of the dam and restoring the natural flow of the Ocklawaha River was the right thing, and frankly, fiscally prudent thing to do. Next. And this shows a comparison of some restoration projects that are somewhat comparable. I worked on the Upper St. Johns River Basin project, and that would cost about $1 billion today. Lake Apopka and the Harris Chain of Lakes, that'd be about $250 million today. Kissimmee, that was just completed fairly recently, that'd be probably over $1 billion today, because that was a couple of years ago. And then the Ocklawaha River is about a $50 million, maybe even if it's a $100 million project, given cost increases over the past few years. It's still by far one of the most cost-effective projects you could possibly invest in. Next. So recreational opportunities. Next. There are opportunities and advantages. Next. The University of Florida, at the direction of Tom Hochter primarily, did a master plan. They had their students take a look at what could be done to make things much more appealing and in the end, much more economically beneficial. Next. This is just an example. You see the dam as it is today, and down below is what it would be like under a potential restoration scenario. And it would be fascinating to have these boardwalks. Again, you could be walking through a restoring floodplain forest. Lots of benefits there, and would be a much more attractive venue for people to come and visit. Next. Likewise, where the new river channel would be created, actually the old river channel recreated, you would have some kind of opportunities for fishing and walking, and, again, just a place to go that would be a very pleasant experience for an outdoor afternoon. Next. Another place that where the Buckman Lock is, the idea would be to keep a portion of that canal that goes out to the St. John's, and you could have a truly state-of-the-art sport fishing and hunting complex there, great access to the St. John's, ideas about putting some duck hunting and other areas, kid fishing areas, lots of ideas that could really enhance the recreational opportunities in the area. Next. And this shows, it's kind of hard to tell, but where the green arrow is, that's where the current headquarters basically for the Buckman Lock is. That's where you would put some kind of a hub. And then you would keep that access to the St. John's, put a marina near the hub there. And again, just have some very nice, very different, very diversified recreational opportunities. Next. So finally, what is the public opinion of this? Next. We have the there was actually St. John's did a survey, got an overwhelming support. A lot of people didn't buy it. So we actually got Barcelo and Company, which is a very highly respected polling company, to do a review of that and do their own poll. And 77% of the folks responding, and these are registered active voters in Putnam and Marion County, wanted to restore the river. Only 6% were against. So huge change from historical perspectives of what the public opinion was. Clearly, the public is in support of this project. Next. Finally, what's the forecast? Well, it's very promising, frankly, for the first time in many years. And I started working on this with Marjorie Carr, who helped stop the Cross Florida Barge Canal back, and started working with her back in about the mid-1970s as an undergrad. I'm back on it again. Anyhow, it's very promising, much more so than it has been in decades. The legislature did appropriate funds to the Water Institute at the University of Florida to do a report on the science and economics and provide an updated cost estimate, with the goal of providing that report prior to the 2025 legislative session. The only potential fly in the ointment on that is the governor. It has to pass the governor's veto period here, but we don't see any reason why it would be vetoed. It's just to get the facts, so the decision makers can make an informed decision. So if that report comes back favorably, we hope there'd be some legislative direction and funding to initiate restoration during the upcoming 2025 legislative session. And finally, my motto is breach or bust 2025. Again, very hopeful. For the first time in many decades, we have a real shot at getting this project underway and bringing back all those benefits to all the ecosystems that would be affected. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Casey. Now we're going to bring back all of our presenters today and do some Q&A. We've got some questions in from the audience, but if you have other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat now, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can. All right, so first question up here, I think, is directed to Lisa. Are chemicals, pesticides really necessary for some of the invasive plants because of how they attach to the eelgrasses? I have heard conflicting information, and Cynthia adds, I'd much prefer the idea of manual removal when necessary.
Thanks for that question, Cynthia. And we're actually seeing conflicting information ourselves. That's one of the things we're doing with gathering water quality data on our SAV expedition to really determine what impact it's having. One thing we found is there's better quality control in some sections of the river when they're doing spraying. So there's more overspray and less in other areas. So there's not consistent quality control. But we're actually adding some protective fences at each of our sites so we can reduce grazing pressure, which is a big problem, to help us tease out some of the other stressors. So you're not the only one getting conflicting information, but we're trying to get to the bottom of it.
Thanks, Lisa. Cynthia also asks, is sewage sludge from sewage treatment plants, septic tanks, or both? And accurately adds, that's disgusting.
It is disgusting. You're absolutely right. It's mostly what we're talking about. The new permitted source is mostly from wastewater treatment facilities. There are some septic sites where they dump septic tanks that's spread out a little bit more. But so we unfortunately have problems with most. But what I was talking about earlier, both, but what I was talking about earlier is from wastewater treatment facilities.
Absolutely. And I would just add, if you ever hear the term biosolids, that is a euphemism for sewage sludge, because sewage sludge is what it really is. But biosolids sounds like something that you're going to be more okay being spread in your community. All right, Mike, speaking about the flow in the Wekiva River and the MFL. So it looks like the district is saying that right now the flow is below what the minimum flowing level is, meaning that the river is suffering significant harm.
It has been below the flow recently. The Wekiva River flow has come back somewhat, But the purpose of these MFLs would be to reduce groundwater pumping or manage groundwater pumping so that the average lows are not lower than what the Water Management District believes is safe to protect the ecosystem. But several of the springs that are tributary to the Wekiva River have been below their current MFLs for years. And so the Water Management District is also looking at those. They will be addressed in the recovery plan. So we're waiting to see what they're proposing as far as how they're going to manage the groundwater withdrawals to protect the springs.
Excellent, Mike. Thank you. And Casey, to the Ocklawaha, we've got a question about fishermen against uniting the rivers, but I think we saw from those survey results that there is, really, really strong support in the local Marion, Putnam County area for Ocklawaha restoration, which, at least to me was a welcome sign, if not a little bit surprising. There's not much in America that 77% of active voters agree on in anything. So for what seems like a controversial issue, there really is a lot of consensus. I think you all have done a wonderful job. You kind of, you had such a big campaign, you had to pick and choose to talk about. You all done a wonderful job of highlighting locally the economic benefits of restoration, which to me really ties into recreation, right? Because when you're talking about economic benefits, there's obviously the ecosystem services, but it's the kayaking, the fishing. I've been out and seen some of those lost springs, and I know thousands of other people would go see them if they were brought back. So can you just talk a little bit about the Reunite the Rivers work to, highlight the restoration and recreation economic elements of the campaign and how you think that's paid off locally?
Sure. Let me just address her question directly first, real quickly. There is a subset of fishermen that do actively use the reservoir that would definitely like to keep the reservoir. But the vast majority of fishermen in this region we're talking about would much rather have a healthy ecosystem and a healthier fishery and could take advantage of that. The other ironic part is before the construction of the dam, the fishermen were very adamantly opposed to the dam because most of them knew this was not going to be a good idea. So we're back to a point now where hopefully we can get to where we should have been. I will say the coalition, which has been in place for almost 5 years now, did a tremendous job. And Margaret Spontak was the leader of that coalition. And she brought a very collaborative approach. She really wanted to give people a different perspective. She wanted to make this a win-win scenario. And that's why there's been a lot of emphasis, like getting the UF group to put together, let's get these concepts so people can see it and understand how things would be different and be better for the economy, be better for recreational opportunities. And that has been hugely successful. And I think that directly contributed to the overwhelming support for this. All the tabling events, all the workshops, everything that's been done has been very positive, very favorable. We don't argue about stuff. We just try to share ideas and let people come to their own conclusions. And I think that's been tremendously beneficial.
Thank you so much, Casey. I couldn't agree more, and I think you all have just done a wonderful job at the local outreach element of all of it. And really, I think Casey or Lisa could take this, but Rory T asks if the manatees in Silver River are trapped behind the dam, which I think is kind of like being trapped in paradise. A little bit compared to being trapped on the other side of the dam, where the waters get cold and there's a lack of food. But you want to address that a little bit, Casey or Lisa?
I'd be happy to, if that's okay. So there are a handful of manatees that do make their way through the lock system and get upstream of the dam. There are a number of them that come to that point and turn around and go back because they're really not familiar with what a lock is and the fact they're really going to get up there. But given the die-off and the reason for the die-off in the Indian River Lagoon was lack of food. So even the manatees that survived, many of them have left that area because that has not recovered. So there are a lot of manatees trying to get somewhere. A few of them have made it through the system. and they are up in the system now. And I think Ryan's point is it's like throw me in that briar patch. There's a lot of food up there. It's going to be warm in the winter. So they're very happy manatees. If they wanted to leave that system, they could go back downstream and go out the lock. But I'm willing to wager they're not going to want to do that. So I wouldn't not consider them trapped. I think they are living the dream up there. And if we could only get a few hundred of their colleagues up there, we could really help that manatee population.
And I would just add, we were at the lock last Wednesday, and there were 5 manatees swimming around wanting to get through, and the lock it's closed on Wednesday, and so they can't flow. They can't get in whenever they want, as they like to talk about. They're trapped sometimes on the wrong side of the lock. And it'd be much better if we have it, and reduce stress on the St. John's as well as the manatees that are trapped in the cold water in the wintertime. So lots of benefit to opening up for manatees.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Kind of a follow-up to that idea. We've heard about kind of 2 major projects today. The Groveland Reservoir project that Lisa talked about in her presentation, and then the Ocklawaha Restoration project. And kind of on the surface, they almost seem similar in that they're both, putting new water into the St. John's River. Yet I know most of us are, highly opposed to Groveland. And I think that the Ocklawaha Restoration is the most important environmental project in Florida. So Lisa, could you talk a little bit about what makes these 2 projects so different?
Absolutely. I mean, Groveland, simply put, is redirecting polluted stormwater running off farmland into the St. John's. They're adding a little bit of treatment, but the bottom line, it's adding no additional benefit to the St. John's River, except adding additional phosphorus on top of what's happening with biosolids and sewage sludge. And then the proposal is then to take the additional fresh water out downstream. So taking out the fresh water and leaving the pollution. But when you compare that to the Ocklawaha and all the benefits that Casey just mentioned, and restoring the natural flow of cooler spring water, as well as restoring nearly 8,000 acres of forested floodplain and wetlands, which are the best biofilters a river system can have.
Absolutely.
And we can go on about the benefits, as Casey just did. So it's totally night and day, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. Mike, one of the things that really struck me watching your presentation, the Wekiva River and Wekiva and Rock Springs, probably have more state and local protections than any other springs outside of maybe the national forests. Yet, you've got a nitrogen TMDL that's in violation. Wekiva is the only spring that has a phosphorus TMDL that's in violation. The river is under its MFL and not, necessarily improving at the rate we'd like to see. And obviously there's the damage to the Little Wekiva River. So for a river system that's so well protected, there are, a lot of issues. In your opinion, what's the disconnect between those laws and rules that are written on the page and what you're actually seeing on the ground in Wekiva with their implementation and, how the river is being treated?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ryan. I think a lot of it has to do with that some of the developments were already in place before the 88 passage of the Wekiva Protection Act, especially some of these subdivisions. So, and unfortunately, the impact of septic tanks on water quality was not recognized for a long time. And then even when it was, there was a proposal by the Department of Health in the late 80s, I believe, early 90s, to limit septic tank impact by requiring additional treatment, but that was killed by the legislature. And so there was no actual effort to control the septic tanks until here recently in the late 2018, 2019 timeframe. So the land use regulations, I think, did not catch up with with what was happening in the river until too late. And then the septic tanks are the same thing. And now we're in the same situation with the fertilizers, because even though Orange and Seminole County have strict fertilizer ordinances, There's very little enforcement. It's basically a voluntary. You volunteer to stay within the guidelines. There's very little control or effort to limit the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers in the Wekiva Basin. So I think that's one of the big areas where we're falling short. And then as what we're finding out is, there is new staff and new council members come on onto these local boards. They're not familiar with the Wekiva Protection Act or so they have to be educated. And sometimes, it takes a lot of work. We have one of our board members who goes to every City of Eustis Commission meeting every other Thursday night, and it takes a lot of effort just to stay on top of this. So we're trying as a volunteer organization, but it takes a lot of effort. And if people are concerned about this and want to help make a difference, we would certainly welcome anyone getting involved with us on that front.
Thanks, Mike. All right, I have one final question for all of you, and we'll start with Casey. But Casey, if there was one thing you could change to help you accomplish your goal of restoring the Ocklawaha, what would it be?
Well, that's kind of a tough question because I really think we're on a really good trajectory. So I think the only things I would wish for would be, for this appropriation to go through unscathed, and we get the facts in front of the decision makers, and they make the right decision. I think it's really that simple.
You've got a compelling case. Mike Cliburn, same question.
Wow, that's tough. The biggest contribution of nitrogen to the waters in Wekiva Basin are fertilizers, and the difficulty is convincing people to that they don't need fertilizers in a lot of cases, and potentially even restricting the amount of St. Augustine grass that is being used in developments. In Las Vegas, they actually pay people to take their grass out and put in, the low or no water landscaping. I'm not sure if we have to come to that point, but we do need more controls on fertilizers and more controls on St. Augustine grass and other water intensive uses.
Absolutely. And Lisa, for the St. John's and as a whole.
Well, I was going to do the ban St. Augustine grass, but Mike beat me to that. I think living within our water means, we have a water use problem. We're still putting 50% of our drinking water on our grass, and that's undermining the health of the springs in the St. John's. And then also, I just wish everyone that cares about our springs and our river would take action. There's a lot of people that depend on the few active advocates. And if we could get everyone that says thank you to us or gets involved to take action, pick up the phone, call their elected officials. We have a huge oyster roast. It's lovely. It's wonderful. And if I could get every single person there to pick up the phone, that would make a huge difference. And so I just think getting that activation is key.
Absolutely. And I think we all, everyone here worked together during legislative session to generate thousands and thousands of contacts to legislators. And we're currently doing the same thing with the governor on the budget and some other important stuff. So I'd like to thank Lisa and Mike and Casey so much for giving us their time tonight. We're so lucky to have them serve on the Florida Springs Council board. For folks who are familiar with the Florida Springs Council, we have an amazing board of folks like Mike and Casey and Lisa that come from, our water groups all over Central and North Florida. They're making a huge difference on their own, and then they come together at FSC to work on, unified policy. So I imagine if you are on this, there is, something here you're interested in. All of these groups need your support, need your volunteer hours, kind of depending on where you are and what your focus is. Check out Florida Springs Council, check out St. John's Riverkeeper, Friends of Wekiva River, and obviously Reunite the River. Make a donation, offer to volunteer, get on their email lists. Really great stuff going on here. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We're going to be doing one of these every month. So look out for the next announcement, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ryan. You do a great job.
Ryan.
Thanks, y'all.
Mhm.